Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Odyssey Recaps Below the Surface Edition. Today we are recapping book or chapter 20, titled by Emily Wilson as The Last Banquet. We open on the very early dawnings of a new day in the Palace of Ithaca. Odysseus, still magically disguised by Athena as an elderly beggar, has spent the night lying in his makeshift bed, full of rage and plotting the deaths of the suitors. He had refused the bed that Penelope had offered him and had instead chosen to spend the night on a pile of fleeces from the sheep the suitors had slaughtered for their feasts, refusing offered comfort and instead lying atop a reminder of all that the suitors have taken from him, albeit a relatively comfortable and fluffy reminder. As Odysseus wrestles with his rage, we get some really interesting bodily imagery. His enraged heart is likened to a mother dog defending her young, and his body itself is likened to a sausage, full of fat and blood, being rotated as it's cooked above a blazing fire before being eaten. This imagery paints Odysseus' rage as transformative. It's almost like a separate entity, a thing that acts upon him, seizing control and transforming his body and mind. Now, as we carry throughout this chapter, I'd like you to think about agency, strategy, and control. Ask yourself to what extent Odysseus' need for violence is a strategic choice, a way for him to reassert himself as leader, and how much is down to other controlling factors, such as the gods, fate, and even his own emotions. Is he ruled by logic or something else? As Odysseus lies plotting in his bed made of the suitor's excess, Athena comes and stands over him. She asks him why he is awake when he is finally in his own home and under the same roof as his wife and son. Odysseus replies that he is wondering how to rid his house of the suitors, as they vastly outnumber him. He tells her, "My biggest fear is this. If you and Zeus help me to kill them, then what? Where can I run to escape my punishment? You tell me." It's notable that his biggest fear isn't dying, it's worry over the consequences of succeeding. And he's not wrong. A mass slaughter of all the sons of the noble houses in the area is not something to take lightly. Ancient Greek literature is filled with tales of acts of vengeance kicking off generations of reciprocal violence. Just within the Odyssey itself, we've had multiple references to the house of Atreus, a family haunted by the cyclical nature of revenge. And again, if you'd like me to talk more about this, just let me know in the comments. But all you really need to know is that the Greeks were very familiar with the concept of revenge, often rebounding violence back onto the revenger. Strategically, mass slaughter might not be the best option, but Athena, who in chapter 16 had told Odysseus that she was itching to fight, dismisses Odysseus' concerns. She reminds him that she is a goddess and she has always protected him. She tells him that he could fight 50 gangs of men and he would still escape, even poaching their sheep and cows on the way out. She tells him to sleep and not worry, that quite soon he will distance himself from trouble. Then she magically puts him to sleep, not giving him time to think about the consequences of violence any longer. Just as Odysseus falls asleep, elsewhere in the castle, Penelope awakens in tears. She sobs in bed and prays to Artemis, asking her to shoot an arrow into her heart and kill her now, or have a gust of wind pick her up and hurl her into the waters of Ocean, which you'll remember is near the land of the dead. She talks about the orphaned daughters of Pandareus, and how despite the aid of the gods, Harpies ultimately seize them and force them to serve the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance. Now, if we follow the logic of some scholars who argue that Penelope has already recognized the beggar as her husband, this could be her worrying, like him, about the possible outcomes of his return to the palace. And if we don't follow that logic, it's still an interesting follow-up to Odysseus' worries of success, with her reminding the listener that, win or lose, the current situation cannot hold for much longer. Penelope is being consumed by fear in the same way the wealth of the house is being consumed by the suitors. Penelope goes on, begging for death, asking Artemis to strike her down with her gaze fixed on Odysseus. She pleads, "Let me not make a lesser husband glad." She loves Odysseus and would prefer to die than marry someone else, which in her mind might be her only real alternative to remarriage. But would the suitors leave even if she died? Or would they simply murder Telemachus then and divide the wealth like they threatened to? I would argue that she, more than anyone else in this text, is trapped by her role as a woman, by the needs of her son, and by her own grief. She cries to the gods that she is unnaturally aggrieved and tormented, as most people can escape their troubles in sleep, but she is cursed by nightmares. She says that last night she dreamed her husband was sleeping next to her, and it seemed as real as a vision, but then she awoke alone once again. The poem now switches back to Odysseus, who has heard his wife's weeping and in his dream state thinks that she is standing next to him, finally recognizing her as, as her long lost husband. By pairing their dreams like this, the poem melds the anguish and longing of husband and wife. For a brief moment in the text, they share a half dream where they are both beside each other once again, not as queen and beggar, but as husband and wife. Eventually, Odysseus awakens fully and dismantles his makeshift bed and goes outside to pray to the gods. Raising his arms to the sky, he calls upon Zeus, begging for a sign. He says, "O Father Zeus, O gods, if you have brought me back on purpose across dry land and sea to my own home, after you made me suffer all that pain, let someone inside speak in words of omen, and Zeus display another sign outside." Despite the reassurances of Athena, Odysseus is still unconvinced that he is on the right path. He needs certainty. Zeus hears his pleas and sends thunder in response, and Odysseus has his answer. For better or worse, the gods have endorsed his actions. But just a reminder that as we've just seen with Penelope's mentions of the daughters of Pandareus, the endorsement and even help of a god doesn't necessarily mean your story will end well. Individual actions, abilities, and the power of fate and rival gods are all still at play. Inside the palace, a slave woman is laboriously grinding wheat for the suitor's bread. She's exhausted and in pain, and when she hears the ominous rumble of thunder, she prays to Zeus that if he sent the thunder to please listen to her prayer and free the palace from the suitors. She is exhausted from the additional labor they cause, and she begs that this banquet be their final meal. Elsewhere in the palace, another slave woman lights the fire in the great hearth, and Telemachus rises from his bed and dresses before coming out to find his nanny, the elderly slave woman Eurycleia. Now, just a reminder that both Telemachus and Eurycleia know that the visiting beggar is really Odysseus in disguise, but they are both unaware that the other one is in on the secret, although I think it highly likely that Eurycleia would guess that Telemachus is aware, but, they each think that they're the only one that knows. Telemachus is angry when he finds out that Odysseus slept on a pile of fleece instead of a real bed, and he scolds Eurycleia and the women of the household in general for neglecting their guest and not ensuring he had a proper bed for the night. He then turns his anger on his mother, saying it's typical of her that she may be clever, but she acts on whims, and that she treats the unwanted guests, the suitors, well and is rude to the better ones. This is obviously wildly unfair, as even without the knowledge we have that Odysseus refused a proper bed, Penelope is given no indication of being anything other than an excellent host to everyone in the palace. Eurycleia, like her masters, is careful with her words and tactfully tells Telemachus not to blame his mother, that it was the beggar himself who refused the bed that Penelope had offered him. Telemachus just turns and marches off without a word, and Eurycleia calls to some of the slave girls, telling them to hurry through their chores to prepare the house once again for the onslaught of the suitors. They must sweep and sprinkle the floors with water, wash down and reset the tables and chairs, wash all the cups and bowls, and fetch water from the spring. And it takes 20 of the girls to fetch the water and carry it back to the palace. Meanwhile, the male slaves are chipping wood for the roaring fires, preparing for yet another day of excessive feasting. This small interlude, much like seeing the prayers of one of the 12 slaves working the mill to grind wheat for the suitor's bread, shows us just how much of a strain the suitors are really placing on every single member of this household. To me, this chapter serves to show us that the tensions between every aspect of the palace and the suitors are nearing breaking point. They can't hold up much longer against this onslaught. As the slaves are rushing to prepare the house, the kindly swineherd Eumaeus returns with more pigs to feed the suitors' endless hunger. He speaks to the disguised Odysseus, asking if he is being treated well by the suitors. Odysseus curses the suitors, telling the swineherd that they are without shame, and they have the gall to abuse him in a house that they don't even own. Then the cruel goat herd arrives with goats for the banquet and returns to his mockery of the disguised Odysseus. He asks why the beggar is still hanging around the palace begging and threatens to beat him. Odysseus doesn't reply, instead bowing his head and focusing on his murderous plans. Then a cowherd arrives with cows to the feast. He sees the disguised Odysseus and is filled with pity, asking the swineherd who this man is and if he knows his ancestry. The cowherd says the man has a noble look for a beggar and says, "When gods spin threads of pain, even great kings are made to wander far and suffer greatly." This is another moment that questions how much agency and control mortals have over their own lives. When the gods spin their threads of pain, there is no escape, not even for a king. It is particularly fitting that the cowherd says this to the swineherd, who told Odysseus previously that he was once a prince. And yet, we must remember that though Odysseus and all around him curse his luck, much of this bad luck is a direct result of a choice Odysseus has made. If he had made the correct sacrifices before leaving Troy, would he have been delayed at all? And if he hadn't taunted the Cyclops Polyphemus and told him his real name out of pride, would Poseidon have trapped him and his men on the island of Helios for so long, leading them to choose between starvation and sacrilege? There's no clear answer, but the question of exactly how much agency and control mortals have over their actions haunts this text. The cowherd approaches the disguised Odysseus and greets him sympathetically, saying he hopes things change for him. He says, "No god is more destructive, Zeus, than you. You are the father of humanity, but you do not take pity on our pain." The cowherd then switches tact, speaking of his grief when he thinks of another man treated unfairly by the gods, the missing king Odysseus. He worries that if his king is still alive somewhere, that he is in as destitute a state as this beggar before him. He talks about how kind Odysseus was to him, entrusting him with his first herd of cattle when he was just a boy. The herds had flourished under Odysseus, but now the suitor's endless greed is slowly devouring the herd, and he's unsure what to do. He thinks they will kill Telemachus and share the wealth of the palace, including the herds of cattle, amongst themselves. He's contemplating just taking the cattle for himself so that they can't get it and leaving in search of another master. But he won't do it as long as Telemachus is alive. Things are unbearable, he says, and yet he can't leave as long as he has hope that somehow one day Odysseus will return and oust the invaders. The disguised Odysseus tells him he has a prophecy that he vows by Zeus is true. The prophecy is that Odysseus will return while he is still here, and the cowherd may watch as he slaughters the swaggering suitors. The loyal cowherd answers that he hopes Zeus allows the beggar's words to come true, and that if so, he would be happy to join in on the fight. But at the same time, the suitors are in another room, plotting once again to murder Telemachus. As they speak, an eagle flies past them holding a wild dove, and one of the suitors, Amphinomus, tells them that this is a sign that their plan to murder Telemachus will fail, and they should instead just think about their banquet that night. The rest of the suitors agree, and they all head inside to slaughter the animals and begin the feast. Once the feast is underway, Telemachus, who has now begun to develop the strategic thinking of his cunning parents, brings the disguised Odysseus into the hall, sets up a table for him, and then serves him dinner, telling him loudly that he will not allow the suitors to abuse him. He says the palace is his, acquired for him by his father, and he won't allow rough treatment of strangers in his home. The suitors are shocked at his newfound boldness, and Antinous, the cruelest of the suitors, says they must accept the threats Telemachus has made because, as annoying as they are, Zeus won't allow them to kill him. Otherwise, they would have managed to do so by now. Telemachus ignores him. Meanwhile, in town, the houseboys of the palace drive 100 animals through town for the Ithacans to sacrifice at a grove dedicated to Apollo, the god of, among other things, archery and prophecy. Inside the palace, the suitors feast, following Telemachus' instructions to feed the disguised Odysseus an equal share of the meat. This is an interesting juxtaposition. The townspeople are slaughtering the animals for pious reasons in a grove. Meanwhile, the suitors, who the text seems to say are slaughtering the animals inside the palace itself, are doing so only to feed their own hunger. They did perform the necessary sacrifices before dining, but there is a striking difference between the animals brought to sacrifice at their table versus the animals brought to sacrifice to the gods. Not to mention the difference between feeding a town and thereby nourishing a population as opposed to feeding an army of rude lords. But back at the palace, at said banquet, Athena is at work. The suitors have agreed not to insult or harm the disguised Odysseus, but she won't allow that. The poem says, Athena would not let the suitors refrain from hurtful insults and abuse, so even deeper bitterness would sink into the heart of great Odysseus. She wants to work both Odysseus and Telemachus into a violent rage. She said she was itching for a fight, and she's manipulating the situation so she can get one worth her attention. One of the suitors, a lawless man, driven to court Penelope out of greed and desire to steal the family's extraordinary wealth, disrespects both Telemachus and Odysseus by hurling an ox foot at the beggar as hard as he can, which the agile Odysseus barely manages to dodge. Telemachus scolds the suitor, telling him it's lucky he didn't hit the visitor, because if he had, Telemachus says, I would have thrust my sword right through your belly, and your father would have held your funeral and not your wedding. Shockingly violent and assertive threats from Telemachus. He goes on to speak to the room at large, saying, "From now on, you all should stay in check here in my house. I used to be a child, but now I understand things good and bad. I have to watch and put up with all this, the slaughtered sheep, the food, the wine. It is hard for a single man to put a stop to such a multitude. But please back down from your hostility to me. Or if you do still want to kill me with bronze swords, go on. I want you to. It would be better to die than have to watch you suitors acting so horribly, abusing strangers, dragging the house girls through my home, molesting them." The weeping, powerless child from the first two chapters is gone, and a line has been drawn in the sand. Telemachus would rather die than put up with watching the suitors destroy the home he has finally claimed as his. But he won't go quietly. He is ready for violence. Now, it's tempting to see this as a positive change. Telemachus is finally taking control of his own destiny, and yet the poem is filled with reminders of mythic and mortal examples of families who are trapped in cycles of violence that can last generations. Is this newfound violence really a strength? And to what extent is it his and not driven by Athena's desire for bloody vengeance? The suitors have fallen silent in the wake of Telemachus' speech. Finally, one speaks. The suitor, named Agelaus, says that the rest of the suitors tells the rest of the suitors that Telemachus' words are fair and they must leave the stranger and the house slaves alone. Then he turns to Telemachus and offers him and his mother some advice. He says them holding the suitors at bay was understandable when they thought Odysseus would return home, but now it's clear that he isn't coming back, and the best thing Telemachus can do now is have Penelope choose one of the gathered suitors to marry. Then she can leave with the suitor and he can stay and enjoy the rest of the wealth left to him by his father. Telemachus agrees with the suitor and, claiming his role as head of the house, says he will tell his mother to pick a husband without delay and he will provide a generous dowry. But he says that he is reluctant to force her to leave the palace if she doesn't want to go. At this moment, something extremely odd and unsettling happens. Athena, possibly displeased with the logical direction the conversation is headed in, once again takes over the suitors' minds. She forces them to laugh unstoppably. The poem says, "They cackled, and they lost control of their own faces. Plates of meat began to drip with blood. Their eyes were full of tears, and they began to wail in grief." Another moment where a peaceful resolution may have been possible, but one that Athena hijacks to force them all back on a path to total annihilation. A prophet is present, and he addresses the cackling crowd, saying, "What awful thing is happening to you? Your faces, heads, and bodies are wrapped up in night. Your screams are blazing out like fire. The ornate palace ceiling and the walls are spattered with your blood. The porch is full of ghosts, as is the courtyard, ghosts descending into the darkness of Erebus. The sun has vanished from the sky, and gloomy mist is all around." This description is eerily similar to what we saw when Odysseus and his men traveled to the underworld in Book 11. The prophet can see the coming slaughter, but the suitors won't or can't heed his warning. They laugh at him, and it's unclear if this is still the crazed laughter forced on them by Athena or if it's their own return bravado. Then the suitor Eurymachus speaks up and mocks the prophet, telling the rest of the suitors they should throw him out. The prophet has one more thing to say before he leaves. He says, "I sense some evil coming for you all, who sit here in Odysseus' house, tormenting and oppressing other people. Not one of you will get away." Is the evil the slaughter that is coming? To rid the palace of evil, must Odysseus and his sons commit evil acts? Or is evil simply the price of power and conquest? Regardless, the suitors don't care, and they don't listen to the prophet, who leaves after giving his last dire warning. The suitors go right back to mocking Telemachus, telling him that he allows the worst people into his home. They tell him he should pack up these strange beggars and sell them as slaves to make a profit. But Telemachus ignores them, and instead just watches his father, waiting for the signal that the time has come to begin their attack. Meanwhile, Penelope has silently joined them at some point during this exchange, and she sits quietly, listening closely to the men. The chapter ends focusing on the suitors. It reads, "They had killed numerous animals and made their banquet with laughter, but no dinner time could be less welcome than the one the mighty man and the goddess would soon bring them in revenge, because they started it and wronged him first." What a powerful ending. In a chapter full of complex questions over choice, agency, and control, we are left with something shockingly simple. Wrongs must be righted. The fate of the suitors was sealed long before this night, and the time for questioning is done. The only thing left is the doing, and soon the prophet's vision may come true and the suitor's blood splattering the walls. And on that creepy note, we are done with chapter 20. Join us tomorrow for chapter 21, an archery contest.